So Colombia and Panama are often seen as somewhat synonymous with each other, but what exactly are their similarities and where do they differ? Hi all, I'm Ezrado and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. Or in this case, Colombia and Panama. See, I noticed that Panama and Colombia often seem to be compared to each other as an expat location due to their many perceived cultural similarities. This is in part due to the fact that they, along with Venezuela and Ecuador, were all part of what was once known as the Republic of Gran Colombia, once they'd separated from Spain back in the early 19th century. Eventually, Venezuela and Ecuador would break away from their republic, but Colombia and Panama stuck together for some time in what then became simply the Republic of Colombia. It wasn't until 1903 that Panama would gain independence as its own country, the Republic of Panama. So from this you can see that Panama and Colombia aren't all that far apart culturally. Having been part of what I'll call Greater Colombia for 82 years, there's definitely going to be some cultural influences. At the same time though, there are definitely some very noticeable differences between the Colombia and Panama of today. Probably one of the first things you'll notice when you visit is that Panama seems to be more of a developed nation. If you consider Colombia to be a second world country, Panama would be maybe first and a half world. I struggle to say it's first world due mainly to the fact that things are often a lot cheaper than first world countries, along with some more noticeable poverty in areas. Compared to Colombia though, it's definitely more expensive, and from my time in Panama City, I can say that it's a lot more built up than even Colombia's biggest cities like Bogota, despite being smaller in area. In Colombia, really the only skyscrapers I can think of are in the international center of Bogota, and even then, there's only a handful of them. There's still a lot of apartment blocks and tall buildings, don't get me wrong, it's not like perpetual suburbia everywhere, but you won't find a kind of grandiose metropolitan vibe where huge flashy skyscrapers dominate the skyline. In Panama, on the other hand, you can see from my video of Panama City here that it really is a grand metropolis akin to the capital of a first world country. The buildings look a lot more expensive and designer compared to a lot of the simpler brick buildings you see in Colombia, and they're clearly a lot taller. Beyond buildings, this greater development also extends to public infrastructure. Although it's only a subtle difference, the roads and footpaths, for instance, do often tend to be better maintained than in Colombia. Overall, I'd say the standard of construction and infrastructure in Panama could honestly stand close to many cities in the US, but let's put buildings and infrastructure aside and take a look at how Panama and Colombia compare from a natural perspective. This is one area where I'd say Colombia does have the upper hand, thanks in no small part to the country's larger size. Thanks to its wider area, Colombia is able to span across several vastly different biomes, giving tourists a lot of variety in places to explore. You can visit the many beaches on either the Atlantic or the Pacific coast. You could check out the second biggest canyon in the world in Santander. You could explore part of the Amazon jungle in Las Amazonas, take a trip to the desert in Rio Hacha or the Savannah Highlands in Casanare, and that's not even beginning to mention the Andes mountain range. As you'd expect with such varied geology, the climate can also differ dramatically due to the varying altitudes. You might think that Colombia is extremely hot since it lies very close to the equator, and whilst this is true in some areas like the southern departments or the coastal areas, a lot of the most popular cities such as Bogota, Medellin, Manizales and Bucaramanga have spring or autumn-like temperatures year-round thanks to their higher altitudes. Looking at the geology and climate of Panama on the other hand, there's definitely a lot less variety. In Panama, you either have mountain biomes or you have beaches. Now, that's not necessarily a downside if you have no intention on traveling around the country and would prefer to settle down in one place, and the landscapes that Panama does offer are nothing short of spectacular. I haven't yet been to the islands of Panama, but from the look of the San Blas Islands especially, it really does look as though Panama's beaches can stand right alongside Colombia's and possibly even exceed them in terms of their beauty. The mountainous regions look just as breathtaking, and I can only imagine what it would be like living in a city like Boquete and waking up to a view like this every day. At least, that's what I would say if I hadn't already lived in a beautiful mountainside city in Colombia. Once again, I gotta compliment Colombia here due to the sheer amount of high altitude cities and towns with breathtaking scenery. Honestly, really every one of these cities and towns I've been to has been flanked by some kind of mountain or hillside or beautiful meadows. If this is the kind of scenery you like, you'll be spoiled for choice in Colombia. Regarding climate, I'd also say Colombia has a lot more choice here. Obviously, the larger variety of biomes gives way to a diverse range of atmospheric conditions, although Panama can obviously range here too between its mountainous and coastal regions. If you just wanted to compare the temperatures of each country's coastal regions though, from my experience, I haven't noticed any stark differences between them. I did hear from a Panameño once who thought that Panama's coastal areas were slightly warmer than Colombia's, but again, nothing I noticed personally. So that's a bit about what to expect from the scenery, both man-made and natural in both countries, but let's talk a bit about culture. If you visited any country in South America, then you'll soon notice that Panama feels a lot more westernized by comparison, partly due to the fact that it's a Central American country. I haven't been everywhere in Latin America, but I do have a theory that the closer you get to the US, the closer the countries become culturally. I mean, it's probably not a perfect rule, but I'd at least say that the US influence is more present in Central America than it is anywhere in the South. In Panama specifically though, you'll quickly notice that there are many more US food chains than in Colombia, for instance. They also use US dollars, and on the whole, with the history of the US's presence relating to the Panama Canal, a lot of their culture seems to have been injected into the country. I also encountered many more Panamanians who could speak English than I did in Colombia, even if it was only a little. Let's talk a bit more about people though. See, the first time I went to Panama, I kind of made the assumption that Panamanians would be very similar to Colombians. I mean, really anywhere in the world, I don't think it's common to cross a country border and then suddenly feel like you're on a different planet. Usually it's a far more gradual change as you move away from the country. Also, outside of geographical proximity, I already mentioned how both countries used to be one for almost a century, so there's obviously going to be some cultural similarities here. And honestly, after my first trip to Panama, this really was my takeaway. I never noticed a huge difference between people's cultural customs, mannerisms, values, and the like. At least not the first time I visited. After my second visit, however, my thoughts changed a little on this. One thing I noticed is that a lot of Panamanians seem to be somewhat less extroverted than a lot of Colombians. I mean, I think on a world scale, Panamanians are still often relatively extroverted people, but compared to Colombians who are often particularly extroverted, I don't think Panamanians are quite as much. I'm really shooting in the dark here, but if I were to hazard a guess, I think the reason for this might be due to Panama's somewhat more individualistic culture, as opposed to the largely collectivist culture you'd see in Colombia. See, because Panama seems to be more of a westernized nation on the whole as I described, I think that's brought with it some of the values you see in the West too, such as the emphasis we place on ourselves as individuals rather than as part of a community. Likely for that reason, I noticed that Panamanians do tend to keep to themselves a little bit more compared to Colombians, but I have to stress that the difference is very subtle, and again, on a world scale, I'd still describe them as a very social culture. If you're staking a big decision on this, like which country to live in, you'll honestly have no problems in either. One more thing I wanted to talk about briefly before closing is safety. Once again, I assumed before coming that Colombia and Panama would be similar in this regard, but it turns out that that's not true at all. In reality, the difference is night and day. As a general guide, you'll see on the 2023 Global Peace Index that Colombia is ranked 140th and Panama 68th. Not only is that place much higher than Colombia, but also the US, which ranks 131st. This is something I can say I definitely felt during my time there. It's not that I was constantly witnessing crime in Colombia or anything like that, but more that I had ease of mind about walking out and about in most places when I was in Panama, which is more than I could say about Colombia. Another big difference is that you don't have to be so careful with your valuable items like your phone in public. When I was in Panama City, for instance, I did this walking video on the coastline of the city where I was filming with my phone for about an hour. I also did some 30+ minute videos with my Sony a7 III, one of which was literally on the side of the road on the Amador Causeway. Although I've done some long form videos in Colombia too, all of those have been either from my accommodation or in the case of the Cocora Valley, a ticketed national park. Filming when out in the city though is just not something I would risk doing in Colombia, maybe in short bursts or in certain highly affluent neighborhoods, but I'd always be cautious of my surroundings as Colombia is definitely more prone to robberies, as I learned the hard way once unfortunately. In Panama, on the other hand, I can take my gear to most places and really not think too much about it. The same would go for jewelry or expensive clothing. It's unlikely you'll be targeted for that, so you can feel free to wear what you want. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this one up here. I hope you learned something new about these countries and how they differ. I'm not going to say which country is better, as I think that largely depends on your personal preferences and what you value. I personally enjoy both, obviously for different reasons, and I'd honestly happily live in either. If you want to know more about specifically Colombia though, feel free to check out my other videos, as this entire channel is dedicated primarily to Colombia, and I have a lot more about the country to share with you all. Until next time though, like, subscribe, bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao!